let's talk about trees. Trees on farms. So thanks for the invitation to speak here. I'm really pleased to be able to share with you some work that comes from a couple of different projects. Specifically for this particular symposium, I wanted to sort of step back, and I've really enjoyed the presentation so far, and I'm seeing some connections. So I'm kind of looking ahead to the special issue that some of us are working on and sort of seeing how our work fits into that. This is work with some colleagues that I will mention at the end. And basically, I want to sort of zoom out to sort of a more policy level. And we start with the basic challenge that's well known to those of us in the room, that we need to effectively double world food production, particularly in Africa, which I should say that my own research and the focus of this talk primarily draws from Africa, but I'd like to make the argument that it's more broadly relevant. So doubling of world food production, but doing it in a sustainable way, so that farms and broader landscapes are more resilient to extreme weather, etc., and that we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions while meeting these other objectives. So what we're talking about here is taking in place in this broader context of the Sustainable Development Goals, shown in this nice infographic here. And I think in that broader context, we'd like to think about efficient solutions as requiring, of course, the necessary increases in yield, but also we'd like to be able to advance as many of the other Sustainable Development Goals as possible, or at least not harm our progress toward them. And finally, retain our ability to continue doing these things into the future. So this will be familiar to some of you. We had a lovely lunch here. A recent delegation from the University of Illinois went to Cuba. Fantastic example of agroforestry system here. And my proposal is that agroforestry, in many contexts in the world, can be a solution to some of these issues. And I think what's been interesting from the other presentations in this part of the symposium is just thinking about when and where might agroforestry be a viable solution, or even the preferred solution. We're not going to do intensive, traditional, mechanized agriculture everywhere for a variety of reasons. But I think there's probably, as I'll conclude with, scope to better understand the conditions under which we might pursue other options, including having trees on farms and other sorts of agroforestry practices. So what are we talking about here? The simple definition I like is agroforestry is agriculture involving trees. ECRAF is Center for International World Center for Agroforestry is just having their strategic plan approved, and they have come up with this kind of pithy definition of what agroforestry is, as being about the practice as well as the science of the interface of and interactions between agriculture and forestry, farmers, livestock, trees, and forests across different scales, all involved. This is probably familiar to many of you in the room, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves, just what is agroforestry? What does it consist of? And in fact, if we look around, trees are often featured in landscapes in ways that we maybe overlook. But this gives a list of some of the kinds of practices that would fall under the grouping of agroforestry. And I think from a sort of intensification perspective, it's interesting to think about which of these imply or are amenable to agricultural intensification of not just of both woody plants as well as annual crops. So this is like rule number one of what not to do in a slide. Lots of text, but this is kind of the heart of what I wanted to do. I found that I did this presentation on a Mac and it wasn't playing well with the PC, so it would have unfolded, but now you get the full thing here. And I want to make the argument that agroforestry has a range of benefits, and I think it's easy to think about trees as being about sort of the bottom couple of these, right? Okay, trees, fine, fine, fine. But this is for environmental reasons. But in fact, there's increasing evidence about how trees can enhance yield. Both, and some of you in this room will know more about that than I will. But I think there needs to be more work on understanding exactly how much and in what conditions trees on farms, agroforestry practices can actually enhance yield. And I list in those first couple of bullet points some of the mechanisms through which this can happen, including increased crop nutrient availability, other ecosystem services. Livelihoods and nutrition are also key benefits from agroforestry systems. I'll present in a moment some work that we've done using nationally representative survey data showing the economic contribution of trees on farms to households in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a growing literature on how trees on farms and the association between dietary diversity and having trees, both forests nearby, but also trees on farms. And then the kind of resilience function of having trees on farms, including fodder availability, and then having resources. Trees have different properties than annual crops and maybe more resistant or resilient in times of extreme weather, as well as different market changes. And then I think the environmental benefits are probably relatively well known. So this is something that we were trying to work up to summarize some of the trade-offs that there may be. And I was noting Cheryl's similar kind of schema. And I wonder if together eventually we might think about coming up with a way to think about more systematically the trade-offs and synergies between agroforestry and industrial agriculture. I think this is I think the picture is a little bit polemical, so I would propose to change that. We don't mean to say that industrial agriculture represented here on the bottom, is kicking up dust, etc. But the point here is that smallholder agroforestry with the blue arrows has positive benefits for these different outcomes that we might be interested in, many of which correspond to Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, intensive agriculture or conventional agriculture, if you will, has also some benefits, but also brings some costs. So I think this kind of schema can be refined, and it's something I kind of like to think through with all of you. But this is our first attempt to sort of capture some of the values from these two different systems. So agroforestry is probably especially relevant for smallholders in tropical countries, and yet it's really overlooked in national policy. And part of the reason is that agriculture and forestry are seen as two separate domains. We don't have ministries of landscapes. We don't have ministries of agroforestry, but we have our ministries of agriculture and ministries of environment typically. So prior to joining the faculty here at Illinois, I was senior forestry specialist at the World Bank, where this was really a big part of the work that I and my colleagues were doing to try to have a policy dialogue around this particular issue. It's hard to know who to talk to. And so trees on farms and agroforestry sort of falls through the cracks. So the argument is that agroforestry is not always an obvious solution, and it has kind of a rough history where clean fields are seen as more valuable, or that having trees around is messy and backwards somehow. And there are indeed colonial policies in much of Africa and elsewhere in the developing world that discouraged people from growing trees on their land. Also, I think making the point that industrial intensification will just not be possible everywhere. It may be possible in more places than it currently is practiced now, which I think some of the work is showing. But just thinking about which type of approach is most appropriate or not, I think is really important. And then particularly in Africa and other parts of the developing world, security of property rights so that people feel that they can make an investment in something like trees, which take a long time to grow and yield benefits, is really important. So what we did, and this will be very brief, is we took living standards measurement survey data collected through a partnership of the World Bank with country governments and the Gates Foundation, which includes nationally representative household survey data. And we looked at those data, and the ISA part is integrated surveys on agriculture. So all of the household data are geo-referenced, which allows really interesting kinds of analyses to be possible. And so we had 20,000 rural households across the 5 countries that you see pictured here, collectively representing about 40% of the population of Africa. And the advantage is that because they're nationally representative, we could do analysis about how trees were, both the prevalence of trees on farms, but also their contribution to household income. And we could then use that information to have policy dialogue at a national scale, so that it wasn't just specific case study areas, but we could say, hey, this is really important or not to your country at the sort of broader scale. So some of the key findings from the work indeed are that trees on farms are widespread across the study countries, with almost a third of rural households reporting having trees on their land. And they also make a really significant economic contribution, particularly in some countries. There was wide variation. On average, they provide about 6% of income to rural households in the countries. But for those that have trees on their farms, it was actually 17% on average, which is not insignificant. We did a series of analyses, regression analyses, trying to understand the determinants of whether and why people would adopt trees on their farms. And I think this is something interesting for us to be thinking about collectively as well. You know, what are the drivers of different land use approaches? And I think, again, we have this segregation between agricultural or traditional agricultural crops and then woody crops. And it would be interesting to think about the different drivers of adoption by crop type. We found that distance to forest was, the closer you were to forest, the more likely you were to have a tree on your farm. And national political context, so the institutions and policies at the national level explained a lot of the variation in the models that we developed. Gender, land, and labor endowments were also really important. The kind of takeaway is that because of the importance of the national context, we think that changes in policies at that level could actually have a really big effect. An obvious point, but I think one worth making. So last slide, or at least second to last. What I want to argue is that agroforestry can be a sustainable and high-yielding solution to food security, which is the topic of our conference. And we need to be careful when we're thinking about the sort of benefits and trade-offs of industrial agriculture or agricultural intensification versus practices like agroforestry. And I sort of sketch out some of the research frontiers, and I think some of this is being addressed by presentations in this symposium, which is fantastic. But particularly, I think more information at a policy relevant scales about what is the contribution of different kinds of agroforestry practices, where are these practices likely to be optimal and preferred, perhaps over other practices, or not preferred, and then what are the barriers to effective uptake of agroforestry practices. So I thank you, and I thank co-authors on the couple of papers that are bound up in this presentation. Thanks. I'll say that we found in the Trees on Farms in Africa work, so we actually broke out different types of trees. We found there wasn't really a standard classification of trees, so we had fruit trees and then tree cash crops and then trees for timber and other non-timber products. So we actually do have some information, and we have information actually by tree species in those data, which may be interesting to you. And frankly, we've only focused at the sort of 40,000 foot policy level, but the data would allow us to look in more detail about this, questions about, fruits and nuts, which is something that we want to do moving forward. So I think I'll maybe leave it there for now, but I appreciate that you've highlighted this important aspect. Thanks.